right, when it comes to moving March break to April, we've heard from the politicians, we've heard from the Chief Medical Officer of Health, of course, who ultimately, so say the politicians, signed off on this, and we've heard from the unions representing the teachers. They're not happy. They're not happy. Although the big question for me is, what is the difference 3 weeks going to make to the exhausted teachers when the big concern is more about the influx of the variants and the intersection of the two, break and then, the spread of the variants. Let's get the take of a science communicator who's also an epidemiologist and one of our go-to guys, Dr. Raywat Deonandan, of course, at the U of O. Good morning, Dr. Ray. How are you, sir?
Good morning. How are you?
I am well. What do you think, first and foremost, about this call to move March break and make it April break?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me about this, and I was dreading talking about it because I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is. I really don't. I'm kind of torn on it. So on the one hand, I understand the motivation. So you don't want people traveling over March break, and you don't want kids at home socializing and getting together. On the other hand, there are other tools to mitigate those scenarios. You can have a overall travel ban to prevent the travel, and you can do what we used to do back in the 70s with low-income families taking March break, is you have a facility in the school for the kids to go there and read their books and hang out in the auditorium. So it doesn't mean you have to cancel the March break outright. So I'm a little confused about whether all of the policy levers have fully been explored here. And you made a good point about what do we gain by just delaying 2-3 weeks. I'm not sure. So I'm not entirely sure what the overall motivation is. I'm not entirely sure whether all of the policy options have been explored.
I guess we should... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, having said all that, I mean, at least we're thinking about it. At least interesting options and creative solutions are being put on the table and tried, which is what we've been calling for throughout this entire pandemic.
Well, and they say knowledge is power, but there's also the expression, when you know better, you do better. But here's the issue. It's great for the unions to point the finger at the government, but isn't it the population, the people who screwed it up over Christmas that got us into this potential mess in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, this is I think it's a mistake to stratify society by government, scientists, media, and people. Mm-hmm. We're all people. And in a liberal democracy, we're all responsible for the outcomes of the choices made by our leaders, essentially. And public health policies are all about incentivizing and disincentivizing behavior. And if the population doesn't behave in accordance with those levers, then the policies have failed. So we have failed in the sense that we did not curtail our socialization over Christmas. And this is also applicable looking at the regional restrictions as opposed to overall restrictions. The assumption is that if you have restrictions in the hot zones and open things up in the green zones, people won't move from the hot zones into the green zones, but they will. So people have to be responsible. Now, does canceling March break provide a disincentive against inappropriate or dangerous behavior? I don't know. It might. But what I'm hoping is that there are other mitigation tools and options to make sure there are no other downstream negative consequences of this.
The other concern that the union's bringing up, and it's a good one, and I want to get your take on it. The province ensures us that our kids are safe in there. Size of the cohort, not an issue. The PPEs that are in place, in other words, the masks, they're not an issue. Otherwise, we'd see bigger numbers in the schools than we do. They're saying, they being the unions, we need to go even further than that. Asymptomatic testing, they want it rolled out big time. They want smaller class sizes. And I get it, but is the threat as severe as they're making it sound?
I think it is. The threat of the new variants is quite dire, and it's like having a new pandemic entirely. And the new variants raise the threshold for herd immunity. They make it harder to protect places like long-term care centers because the disease gets in more easily. Now, vaccination, solves all these problems, but we haven't got those vaccination tools yet. So is the threat as great as they're suggesting? I think it is. Now, does that mean we have to invest in all these tools to reduce the threat? I think we do, because there is no downside except financial. You make class sizes smaller, that's a long-term educational win over the next few years. You do asymptomatic surveillance. That's not that expensive, to be honest. And that allows us to manage the epidemic for the next year or so as the vaccination rolls out. Remember, we're past the midway point of the pandemic. We'll be done most of this by the end of this year. But we still have several months to endure. And so if we spend the money now, we can endure those months in relative comfort.
All right, so you say that the teachers are raising a good point with the threat of the variant, given the status and the measures that are in place in the school. So now let me ask you, as a parent listening, they may be saying, oh, well, if an epidemiologist and science communicator who is very respected throughout this pandemic for his insight and analysis is saying that maybe there is a threat here. As a parent, and especially if I have a grandparent at home with me or someone who's immunocompromised, do I have to think twice now about sending my kids to school?
Boy, you ask a really tough question.
It's my job.
None of this has changed. I mean, this is the question that we're asking throughout the entirety of the pandemic, and hopefully, people have procedures in place at home to protect their elderly. And with the new variant, the threat to our elderly has definitely heightened. But hopefully, those procedures you have in place at home still apply. So, what does that mean for March break? Taking your kid home for March break doesn't increase the risk to the elderly parent you live with or grandparent because they're there during the weekends and evenings anyway. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's all really complicated. What I will say is that what it means is, as a society, we have to continue to invest in our individual mitigation tools like the mask wearing and distancing and staying away from social gatherings so that we individually don't become infected and therefore become vectors of transmission. And as leaders, we need to get that vaccination rollout back on track. That's our best way out of this.
Let me ask you on a side note here. If you're a grandparent living with a family and your grandchild is going to school, should you be masking every time you see your grandchild for the foreseeable future, even if you live in the same house? Maybe restrict the time you spend together? How severely inside the house should we go?
Inside the house is pretty much impossible.
Yeah.
Let's be honest here. If you're wearing a mask around your kid inside the house, you can't sustain that throughout the year. It's not possible. What we are hoping, and again, this is a word, it's hope, is that school transmission is so poor and it reflects community transmission that the likelihood of bringing it home is small. It's not zero, but it's small. Remember, here in Ottawa, for example, we have, 1,000 active cases at the most, probably much less than that.
Yeah.
A population of 1 million.
Yep.
So the probability of encountering someone with an active case is 1 in 1,000. It's small.
Yep.
It's just that when this is scaled up to 1 million people, the probability of it happening somewhere is high. We have to distinguish between individual risk and population risk. The risk to individuals still remains low. So you with your kid going to school and living with your parents and so forth, the risk is low. It's just that the low risk applied to hundreds of thousands of people manifests as a high risk to the population. What does that mean? It means that if everyone does their part and just avoids the super spreading opportunities, we'll probably be okay. So the advice I would give to a grandparent living with a grandchild is make sure that grandchild doesn't do anything untoward other than going to school and coming home, and you're probably fine.
Even if they have a bubble down the street?
Man, you're just complicating the scenarios.
Well, it's reality, right? I mean, the grandkid can't stay in the house and, they play with their friends. Yeah. Maybe even they're in the same school as them. You know what I mean? The rules are being bent by so many, but I worry about those with the highest risk.
That's right. Now, if you're really high risk, like if you're over 80 and you're immunocompromised to some extent, I think staying sequestered in the home away from the child as much as you can is important. COVID is airborne. So it's going to get into your system somehow if it enters the house, given the fact that you're sharing the same air. So things you can do in the home include improving air quality, get an air purifier, things circulating, do regular symptom checks of everybody in the household. And the second someone shows a symptom, you get them tested and make sure that they're okay. Other than that, unfortunately, there isn't a whole lot you can do as an individual at home.
All right, final question. We're hearing about, in the words of one infectious disease specialist, the third wave is going to get ugly in April because of the variants. You want to weigh in on how ugly that's going to get, in your opinion?
It's going to get bad. Now, there's going to be a third wave. I think that's pretty much guaranteed, mostly because we are resembling the 1918 Spanish flu, and they had a third wave in the spring as well. And also behavior tells us that the nature of these waves is such that when people go back into society, a third wave will be upon us. The big unknown is that whether the new variants will be the mechanism of the third wave, and it seems that they might. And if that's the case numbers are going to be exploding. But we have done a good job vaccinating our long-term care centers and our most vulnerable. So I don't think the mortality rate is going to be as high. and the hospitalization rate might not be as high.
That's
as
what the
well,
modeling
especially-
shows, yeah, too.
Right. So while the case numbers will be high, it won't be the same stress on our healthcare system, I hope, maybe.
There's also a snapshot in the Indigenous communities this week. I heard Mark Miller, the minister responsible federally, saying basically we threw a lot of ammo into the Indigenous communities for obvious reasons, and we're seeing already the effect where the number of case transmissions down and the number of hospitalizations down. I mean, isn't that a snapshot of what we're going to live hopefully soon?
100%, yes. And we're seeing the same thing in places around the world where the vaccination penetration is much better, like Israel. So the big question always is, will vaccination result in diminished transmission? I think it will. I mean, data from the AstraZeneca trial shows that it does.
Yep.
And we have every sign epidemiologically that will be the case. So I'm very hopeful is the right word. I'm very sanguine, positive, optimistic about the capacity for vaccination to diminish transmission. So again, this third wave, the case numbers will be high, but I don't think the death rate will be.
I appreciate you balancing a lot at your house. I appreciate you coming on and staying focused, Dr. Ray. Dr. Raywat Deonandan, dad, is apparently a dog owner too there, right?
Oh, God, yes, he's annoying.
Not at all. It's real. Thanks, Dr. Ray. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend. 10:17. We'll